special sauce. The lab report later confirmed that the viscosity of the substance found on my face was achieved through a slow reduction of collagen sugar and high fructose corn syrup. But the iron content was off the charts. When the detectives eventually raided Unit 4B, they found 15 industrial squeeze bottles in the fridge, each neatly labeled by vintage and flavor profile. I wasn't just a delivery driver that night. I was the final ingredient for a recipe that had been perfecting itself in the dark for 3 years. But when he first opened the door with that translucent skin pulled too tight over his skull and eyes that bulged like boiled eggs, I didn't see a predator. I saw a lonely, sick man who probably had a severe thyroid condition or was undergoing chemotherapy. That is the fatal flaw of empathy in the gig economy. It serves as the marinade that makes you tender enough to kill. The night didn't start with blood. It started with the relentless, drumming misery of a Philadelphia downpour. It was a Thursday, the kind of November evening that felt less like weather and more like a personal assault. My 2008 Honda Civic was vibrating violently at every red light, the engine-mounting brackets having given up the ghost somewhere around the 180,000 mile mark. The windshield wipers were fighting a losing battle against the sheet of water hammering the glass, creating a blurry, distorted view of the world that matched my mental state perfectly. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of stale French fries, wet upholstery, and the sharp metallic tang of my own anxiety. I was 24 years old, a law school dropout with $30,000 in student loans and a gambling debt that was currently owned by men who didn't believe in grace periods. My phone, mounted on the dashboard with a cheap magnetic clip, was the taskmaster governing my existence. It glowed with the Uber Eats interface, a beacon of blue light in the gloom, calculating my worth in $3 increments. I had been driving for 9 hours. My lower back felt like it was being compressed by a hydraulic press, and my eyes were burning from the glare of oncoming headlights reflecting off the wet asphalt. I was done. I had promised myself I was done an hour ago. But then the notification chimed, a cheerful, upbeat ding that sounded perverse against the backdrop of the storm. New request, $48.50. Priority delivery, 2.4 miles. I stared at the screen. Almost $50 for a single run. That was unheard of. Usually a payout that high meant you were hauling catering trays for a corporate lunch or driving 20 miles out into the suburbs. But this was a short trip, a double cheeseburger meal, from a generic late-night diner heading to an address on the chaotic fringe of the city, where the gentrified lofts gave way to abandoned textile factories. The tip had to be massive. Logic dictated that there was a catch. Maybe the drop-off was in a construction zone or the customer was notorious for baiting drivers. But my bank account was currently overdrawn by $12, and I needed gas just to get home. Last one, I whispered to the empty car, my voice cracking slightly. One more run, Liam, then you sleep. I tapped accept. The screen flashed, locking in my fate. The pickup was uneventful, just a grease-stained paper bag handed over by a bored teenager through a drive-through window. The smell of the burger was overpowering in the enclosed space of the car. Hot grease, melted cheese, and onions. It made my stomach cramp with hunger, a cruel reminder that I hadn't eaten since breakfast. I threw the bag onto the passenger seat and followed the GPS line as it snaked away from the safety of the illuminated avenues and toward the industrial district. The destination was a building known locally as the Rookery. It was a towering architectural carcass from the Victorian era, originally a tannery, then a tenement, and now a place where people lived when they had run out of other options. It sat alone on a block of boarded-up row homes, a massive brick structure that seemed to absorb the streetlights rather than reflect them. As I pulled up to the curb, the rain intensified, sounding like gravel being thrown against the roof of the car. There were no other vehicles parked on the street, just a long stretch of broken sidewalk and overflowing gutters choking on wet autumn leaves. I killed the engine. The silence that rushed in was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic thrum of the rain. I grabbed the brown paper bag, checking the app instructions one last time. Unit 4B, knock 3 times. Wait, simple enough. I pulled my hood up, took a deep breath of the damp, cold air, and stepped out into the deluge. The water soaked through my sneakers instantly. I jogged to the front entrance, dodging puddles that looked deep enough to swallow an ankle. The main door to the building was heavy oak, the varnish peeling away like dead skin, revealing gray, waterlogged wood beneath. It wasn't locked. The latch clicked open with a rusty groan, and I stepped into the vestibule. The smell hit me first. It wasn't the usual tenement bouquet of marijuana and boiled cabbage. It was something sweeter, thicker. It smelled like copper and caramelized sugar with a faint underlying note of bleach. It reminded me of the back room of a butcher shop after closing time when the sawdust is wet and the cleaning chemicals are sprayed over the day's refuse. "Hello!" I called out, my voice echoing up the stairwell. The lobby was empty. A single fluorescent bulb flickered overhead, buzzing like an angry insect, casting a sickly yellow pallor over the peeling wallpaper. The elevator doors were welded shut, covered in layers of graffiti that had been painted over and tagged again so many times it looked like scar tissue. That meant stairs, 4 flights. I started the climb, the paper bag crinkling in my grip. The wooden steps groaned under my weight, shifting slightly, as if the building itself was adjusting to my presence. By the time I reached the 3rd floor, I was winded, my heart hammering a little faster than the exertion warranted. I paused on the landing to catch my breath, looking down at the linoleum floor. There were spots on the ground, dark brownish-red droplets leading from the stairs up toward the 4th floor. I crouched down, squinting in the dim light. They were dry, flaking at the edges. Rust water, I told myself, standing up quickly. Just rusty water dripping from a pipe somewhere. Or maybe someone dragged a leaking trash bag. It was the lie we tell ourselves to keep the world rational. The human brain is a magnificent editor. It cuts out the frames of a horror movie that don't fit the genre of a mundane drama. I wiped a raindrop from my nose and continued upward, deliberately not looking at the trail that seemed to thicken as I ascended. The 4th floor was a long, narrow corridor with doors on only one side. The lighting here was worse. One bulb was burnt out and the other was so dim it barely illuminated the dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. The silence was absolute. No televisions blaring late-night talk shows, no arguments through thin walls, no crying babies. It felt like the building was holding its breath. I walked down the hall, counting the brass numbers nailed to the doors. 4A, 4B. The door to 4B was different from the others. While the rest were chipped and weathered, this door was freshly painted a deep, glossy black. The brass knocker was polished to a mirror shine, contrasting violently with the squalor of the hallway. It looked like a portal to another world inserted into a ruin. I checked the app again. Knock 3 times. Wait. I raised my fist and knocked. Thud, thud, thud. The sound was solid heavy. I waited. 10 seconds, 20. I shifted my weight, water dripping from my jacket onto the floorboards. The urge to just leave the food and run was sudden and overwhelming. I could take a photo, mark it as delivered, and get out of this tomb. But the $50 tip, I needed that money to keep the loan sharks from breaking my fingers next week. I was about to knock again when I heard it, the sound of a lock tumbling. Not just one, but a sequence. Click, clack, thump. 3 separate deadbolts disengaging with the precision of a bank vault. The door creaked open just a few inches. A slice of darkness stared back at me. "Uber Eats," I said, forcing a professional cheerfulness into my voice. "Delivery for Arthur." The door opened wider, revealing the tenant. He was tall, incredibly gaunt, wearing a pair of dark gray slacks and a pristine white dress shirt buttoned all the way to his Adam's apple. He wore no shoes. His feet were pale and bare against the dark floorboards of his apartment. But it was his face that froze the breath in my lungs. He had no eyebrows, no eyelashes. His head was completely bald, the skin shining under the hallway light as if it had been polished. His complexion wasn't just pale, it was translucent, a milky white that showed the road map of blue veins pulsing at his temples. His lips were thin, almost non-existent, a slash of pink in a sea of white. He looked unfinished, like a clay sculpture that had been pulled from the kiln before the artist could carve the humanity into it. "You're late," he whispered. His voice was smooth, melodic, utterly at odds with his appearance. It sounded like a radio announcer speaking from the bottom of a well. "Sorry about that," I stammered, holding out the bag. "The storm is brutal out there. Roads are flooded." He didn't blink. I wasn't sure if he could blink without eyelashes. He just stared at me, his eyes dark and wet, absorbing the light. He reached out a hand to take the bag. His fingers were long, skeletal, and tipped with nails that were manicured to sharp points. As he took the bag, his cold skin brushed against my knuckles. It felt dry and papery like dead leaves. "The temperature," he murmured, clutching the bag to his chest. "It feels compromised. Did you use the thermal insulation?" "Yes, sir. It was in the hot bag the whole way." He turned his back on me, leaving the door wide open. He walked into the center of the room, placing the greasy bag on a small, solitary wooden table. I got my first look at the interior. The apartment was terrifyingly empty. There was no furniture, no couch, no TV, no bookshelves. Just the small table and the polished wooden floor. The walls were stripped to the brick, but they were clean. Scrubbed. The only light came from the kitchen area in the back, a clinical white glow that spilled out like a chemical spill. Arthur opened the bag with the precision of a surgeon. He didn't rip the paper. He unfolded the creases gently. He took out the burger box and the fries. He opened the burger container, lifting the bun with 2 fingers to inspect the meat. He sniffed at his nostrils, flaring. I stood in the doorway, water pooling around my feet. "Is everything okay?" He froze. Slowly, mechanically, he turned his head to look at me. The expression on his face had shifted. The blankness was gone, replaced by a look of profound, devastating disappointment. It was the look a parent gives a child who has just broken a priceless heirloom. "Where is it?" he hissed. "Where is it?" "What?" "The sauce," he said, his voice rising and pitch cracking slightly. "The reduction, the binding agent. I specified it in the notes. It is essential for the profile." I pulled my phone out my hands, trembling slightly. Let me check. I didn't see any special instructions for sauce. I scrolled through the order history. Standard burger, large fries, Coke, no notes. "It's not here, sir. The receipt doesn't mention any extra sauce." Arthur turned fully toward me. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. They always forget. They think flavor is optional. They think consumption is just mechanics. He took a step toward me. "How can I savor the texture without the lubrication?" "Look, I'm sorry," I said, stepping back into the hallway. "I can go back. I can check my car. Maybe the restaurant put it in a separate bag and it slid under the seat. I have a backup stash of condiments in my glove box." It was a lie. A desperate, stupid lie to diffuse the tension. I just wanted to get downstairs, get in my car, and drive until this building was a memory. Arthur stopped. His head tilted to the side like a bird studying a worm. A slow, grotesque smile spread across his face, stretching the skin until I thought it might tear. "You would do that? You would return for me?" "Yeah, absolutely. Customer service is priority 1, I said, backing away further. "Just give me 2 minutes, I'll run down and grab it." 2 minutes, he repeated. "Time is an ingredient, you know." "Right, be right back." I turned around. The hallway stretched out before me, the distance to the stairs seeming to have doubled since I arrived. I took a step relief, flooding my system. I just had to get to the stairs. I wouldn't come back. I would cancel the order reporting for being aggressive and eat the loss on the tip. Screw the money. Nothing was worth this feeling of primal dread. I took 3 steps. I didn't hear him move. A man that size on a wooden floor should have made a sound. A creak, a footfall, something. But he moved like smoke. The sensation wasn't pain, not at first. It was a sudden violent pressure against the side of my neck, followed by a sharp, icy sting. It felt like being stung by a giant hornet. My vision swam instantly. The hallway tilted 45 degrees to the left. My legs, which had been carrying me toward safety, suddenly turned to rubber. I tried to turn around to swing my fist to scream, but my motor functions disconnected from my brain. I slumped against the peeling wallpaper, sliding down toward the dirty floor. Through the haze of gray static overtaking my eyes, I saw Arthur standing over me. He wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding a small, empty syringe. He looked down at me with that same clinical curiosity, wiping a droplet of rain from his forehead. "You have excellent vascularity," he noted, his voice sounding like it was coming from underwater. "Stress improves the circulation. It flushes the toxins from the muscle fibers." I tried to speak. I wanted to say please, I wanted to say help. But all that came out was a wet, gurgling wheeze. My tongue felt too big for my mouth. Arthur knelt beside me. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked excited. He reached out and stroked my cheek with the back of his hand, his touch surprisingly gentle, almost loving. "Don't worry about the sauce," he whispered, his face inches from mine. I could smell his breath. It smelled of raw meat and mint mouthwash. "The sauce requires a base, and you brought plenty of it with you." He grabbed the collar of my jacket and began to drag me. I felt the friction of the floor against my legs, felt my sneakers squeaking as they trailed uselessly behind me. He dragged me across the threshold into the apartment that smelled of copper and sugar. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me completely was his bare foot kicking the door shut. The 3 locks engaged, click, clack, thump, and then silence. The drug he had used was efficient. It didn't just put you to sleep, it paralyzed the will. I drifted in a void that was neither sleep nor wakefulness, a limbo where time had no meaning. I remember hearing sounds, the snip of scissors, the rustle of plastic sheeting, the humming of a large appliance, perhaps a freezer. But I couldn't react. I was a passenger in my own body, trapped behind a wall of glass, screaming without a voice. When I finally clawed my way back to consciousness, the first thing I registered was the cold, bone-deep, biting cold. I opened my eyes. I was no longer in the hallway. I was in a room tiled in white porcelain from floor to ceiling. The harsh fluorescent light drilled into my retinas. I tried to sit up, but my body refused to obey. I looked down. I was lying in a bathtub, an old-fashioned clawfoot tub with chipped enamel. But I wasn't floating in water. I was buried up to my waist in crushed ice. My panic spiked a hot rush of adrenaline that warred with the lethargy of the drug. I yanked my arms. They were pulled taut behind my back, my wrists secured to the heavy iron plumbing of the tub with thick black industrial zip ties. I kicked my legs. My ankles were bound together with the same plastic restraints. "Hello!" I screamed, but the sound was muffled. There was a strip of duct tape over my mouth. I could only make a pathetic nasal grunt. I thrashed against the restraints, splashing the ice onto the tiled floor. The noise echoed loudly in the small space. The bathroom smelled overwhelming now, mildew, bleach, and that sickeningly sweet copper scent. Opposite the tub, there was a large mirror mounted on the wall. I caught my reflection, and for a second my brain refused to process what I was seeing. I wasn't just tied up, I was prepared. My shirt and jacket were gone. My chest was bare, shivering in the cold air. But my face, someone had applied a thick, viscous paste to my face. It was yellowish red, smeared artfully across my cheeks, forehead, and chin. It dripped slowly down my neck. I could smell it now, mustard, ketchup, honey, and something else that smelled distinctively metallic. Sprigs of rosemary and thyme were tucked behind my ears, the stems scratching against my skin. I looked like a centerpiece. I looked like a holiday roast waiting for the oven. The door to the bathroom creaked open. Arthur stepped in. The transformation was complete. The white shirt was gone. He was now naked from the waist up, wearing a clear, heavy-duty plastic apron that was spattered with old dark stains. He wore elbow-length rubber gloves. In his right hand he held a rusted meat cleaver. In his left a small paring knife. He didn't look at my eyes. He looked at my chest, tracing the lines of my ribs with his gaze. He began to rub the blades together. Shh, shh, shh. The sound of metal on metal was rhythmic, hypnotic. He hummed a tune that sounded vaguely like a lullaby, but the notes were all wrong, twisted into a minor key that set my teeth on edge. He walked over to the sink, turning his back to me for a moment to adjust something on the counter. I saw the lineup of his tools: a bone saw, a tenderizing mallet, a blowtorch, and right at the edge of the counter, glistening under the lights, was a large bottle of heavy-duty drain cleaner. Arthur turned back around, his eyes wide with a terrifying childlike glee. He walked toward the tub, the cleaver swaying by his side. He leaned over, resting his gloved hands on the rim of the tub, ignoring my frantic struggles. He reached out and ripped the tape from my mouth in one violent motion. I gasped the air, burning my lungs. "Please!" I choked out, tears streaming down my face, mixing with the condiment glaze. "Please take the money, take the car. I won't tell anyone." Arthur laughed. It wasn't a villain's laugh. It was a soft, genuine chuckle, like I had just told a witty joke at a dinner party. "Money?" he asked, tilting his head. "You think this is a transaction? No, Liam. This is communion." He raised the cleaver, inspecting the edge. "I have been waiting all day," he whispered. "The anticipation is the best spice. Now, rise and shine." He pointed the paring knife at my chest. "We have a decision to make. The connective tissue in your legs is strong, probably from all those stairs. It requires patience." He grinned, exposing teeth that were filed to unnatural sharpness. "So tell me," he hissed, leaning in so close I could see the pores he didn't have. "Slow-cooked or raw, you decide." The question hung in the antiseptic air of the bathroom, vibrating with a kind of obscene playfulness that made my stomach heave against the wall of crushed ice compressing my abdomen. Slow-cooked or raw? It wasn't a threat. Threats imply a desire to intimidate, to coerce. This was a menu option. Arthur was soliciting a preference for my own deconstruction, as if he were asking how I took my coffee. I couldn't answer. My jaw was locked so tight my teeth felt like they were cracking under the pressure. The sheer absurdity of the moment short-circuited my brain's ability to process language. I was a 24-year-old man who 2 hours ago was worrying about the interest rate on a payday loan. Now I was a side of beef in a makeshift abattoir, being asked to participate in the culinary logistics of my own death. Arthur didn't seem to mind my silence. He treated it as a period of contemplation, a diner perusing the specials. He turned back to the counter, setting the meat cleaver down on a folded white towel with a reverence that was terrifying. He picked up a small stainless steel bowl and a basting brush. "Most people don't appreciate the texture of raw meat," he mused, his back to me. "They are conditioned by society to fear the primal. They want fire. They want the Maillard reaction to mask the truth of what they are consuming. But sashimi is honesty. It is the flesh without the lie." He dipped the brush into the bowl and turned back to me. The mixture inside was thick, dark, and pungent. He leaned over the tub again, and I recoiled as far as the zip ties would allow, my spine grinding against the cold porcelain. "But given the weather," Arthur continued, his voice soft, almost soothing, "I think we need warmth. We need to honor the heat that is still trapped inside you." He began to paint my chest. The sensation was horrifying. The bristles were stiff, scratching against my shivering skin, leaving trails of the cold, sticky glaze. The smell hit me instantly, overpowering the bleach and mildew. It was vinegar, molasses, and something deeply metallic like a handful of wet pennies. I realized with a jolt of nausea that the metallic smell wasn't an ingredient from a bottle. It was biological. It was the smell of old blood that had oxidized and turned black. "What is that?" I gagged, the taste of bile rising in my throat. "What are you putting on me?" Arthur paused, the brush hovering over my sternum. He looked hurt. "It's a reduction," he explained patiently. "A glaze I developed specifically for long pig. Ketchup provides the acid and sugar, mustard for the heat, honey for the caramelization, and the rest, well, a good chef never reveals his stock, Liam. Let's just say it's locally sourced from previous guests. It helps bridge the flavor profile between you and them. He resumed painting, coating my collarbones, my shoulders. I closed my eyes, trying to dissociate, trying to pretend I was anywhere else. I focused on the sounds. The drip, drip of a faucet somewhere in the apartment. The humming of the refrigerator. The shallow, ragged sound of my own breathing. But I couldn't block out the sensation of him. He wasn't hurting me, not yet, but the intimacy of it was a violation worse than violence. He was claiming ownership of my body, transforming it from a vessel of life into a commodity. My mother, Arthur said, his voice taking on a distant, dreamy quality. She never understood temperature. She served everything cold, cold soup, cold heavy stews, cold love. She said heat was a waste of energy. She said we should be grateful for the calories regardless of the form. He moved the brush down to my stomach, pushing aside the ice chips. The cold was seeping into my organs now. My legs were numb, dead weights that felt disconnected from my torso. I started to shiver violently, shaking the tub. "Stop moving," Arthur snapped. It wasn't a shout, but the sudden sharpness in his tone was like a whip crack. He tapped the flat side of the paring knife against my forehead. "You'll ruin the evenness of the coat. Stress is good for the meat, Liam, but panic makes the muscle fibers tight. We want tender, we want yield." "Why are you doing this?" I whispered, my voice breaking. "I'm just a driver. I'm nobody. Nobody will care if I'm gone. You won't get any glory from this." Arthur stopped painting. He set the brush down and leaned against the sink, crossing his arms over his plastic apron. He looked at me with genuine pity. "Glory." He chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "You think this is about ego? You think I'm one of those televised narcissists seeking fame, oh Liam? You really are a product of your generation?" He walked over to the mirror, inspecting his own reflection, the hairless, pale visage that looked like a deep-sea creature brought to the surface. "This is about correction," he said, turning back to me. "The world is full of waste. People eat without tasting. They shove processed garbage down their throats while driving, while watching screens, while arguing. They treat the sacred act of consumption as a biological refueling stop. It's disrespectful. It's profane." He picked up the meat cleaver again, weighing it in his hand. "I am restoring the ritual," he declared, his eyes widening, the pupils pinpricks of black madness. "To eat is to absorb. To take the life of another and make it part of your own. It requires intimacy. It requires preparation. And you, Liam, you are a perfect specimen. Young, lean, a little too much caffeine in your system perhaps, but the adrenaline will balance that out. You aren't nobody. Tonight, you are the most important thing in the world. You are the sacrament." My mind raced, searching for a crack in his logic, a way to talk him down. I remembered reading somewhere that you should humanize yourself to an attacker. Make them see you as a person, not an object. "I have a family," I lied. I didn't. My parents were dead and my sister hadn't spoken to me in 3 years, since I stole her engagement ring to pay a bookie. But Arthur didn't know that. I have a little girl. She's 3. She's waiting for me to come home. She likes pancakes. Arthur's expression didn't soften. It hardened. A look of disgust rippled across his smooth features. "Pancakes," he spat the word like a curse. "Flour and sugar syrup, empty calories for an empty life. Does she know what meat tastes like, Liam, real meat? The kind that screams before it silences?" He stepped closer to the tub, looming over me. The fluorescent light reflected off his bald head, creating a halo of artificial divinity. "Don't worry," he whispered. "I won't waste any part of you. The leftovers, maybe I'll grind them. Make a nice slider. Maybe I'll order a delivery myself. Send a little piece of you to that little girl. Would you like that, a daddy burger?" The bile finally won. I retched, heaving dryly, my body convulsing against the restraints. Arthur watched with fascination as if my vomiting was just another interesting biological reaction to observe. "Good," he murmured. "Empty the stomach." "Cleaner that way." He reached into the pocket of his apron and pulled out a timer, a simple white plastic kitchen timer shaped like an egg. He twisted the dial. Tick, 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 tick. He set it on the edge of the sink. 20 minutes, he announced. That's how long the glaze needs to set. It needs to bond with the epidermis. If I cut too soon, the flavor separates. We can't have that. He looked around the bathroom, checking his station. The bone saw the mallet, the knives. He frowned slightly. "I forgot the heat source," he muttered to himself. "The blowtorch is in the pantry. And the rosemary. I need fresh rosemary for the smoke infusion." He turned to me, pointing the cleaver at my face. "You stay here, marinate. Think about your life. Think about all the mediocre meals you've eaten. Think about how for the first time you are going to be part of something exquisite." He walked to the door, his bare feet making wet slapping sounds on the tiles. He paused at the threshold, looking back with a grin that stretched too wide, exposing pink gums. "Don't go anywhere," he giggled, a high-pitched childish giggle that was infinitely worse than his monotone lecturing. Then he walked out, closing the door. He didn't lock it. He didn't need to. I was zip-tied to a cast-iron tub filled with ice. I wasn't going anywhere. The moment the door clicked shut, the silence of the bathroom crashed down on me. The only sound was the ticking of the egg timer. Tick, tick, tick. It was the sound of a countdown to a nightmare. I began to hyperventilate. The air felt too thin. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would bruise the skin from the inside. 20 minutes. I had 20 minutes before he came back with a blowtorch to turn me into a human creme brulee. "Think, Liam, think," I whispered, my voice shaking uncontrollably. I tested the restraints again. I pulled my wrists apart with everything I had. The heavy-duty plastic bit into my skin, cutting off circulation. I felt a trickle of warm blood run down my forearm, mixing with the melting ice. It was useless. The zip ties were the thick kind used for construction or police raids. They were rated to hold hundreds of pounds. I tried to move my legs. My ankles were bound together and the chain of ties was looped around the faucet of the tub. I kicked out my feet, splashing in the bloody slush. The faucet groaned, but it was solid brass bolted into the wall decades ago. It wasn't going to break. I was trapped. I was going to die here. I was going to be butchered by a man who looked like a hard-boiled egg and thought cannibalism was a spiritual awakening. Despair, black and heavy, began to settle over me. I slumped back against the porcelain, the fight draining out of me. Maybe I should just let it happen. Maybe the shock would kill me before the knife did. Maybe if I passed out. No. A sudden, fierce anger ignited in my gut. It was the anger of the downtrodden, the anger of every time I'd been stiffed on a tip, every time a landlord threatened eviction, every time the world told me I was disposable. I was a screw-up, a gambler, a loser, but I was not food. I was not a menu item. I forced my eyes open and scanned the room. I needed a weapon. I needed a tool. Anything. The bathroom was sparse. The toilet was too far away. The towel rack was empty. The mirror was bolted to the wall. My eyes fell on the counter next to the sink. It was about 6 feet away from the edge of the tub. On the counter lay Arthur's toolkit, the mallet, the bone saw. The paring knife was there too. He had left it. He had taken the cleaver but left the small knife. If I could reach that knife. I strained against the ties, leaning my torso forward as far as I could. The tub was long and I was tied at the faucet end. I stretched my muscles, screaming. I was 3 feet short. I might as well have been reaching for the moon. I collapsed back, sobbing in frustration. Tick, tick, tick. The timer mocked me. 5 minutes had passed, 15 left. I looked at the counter again, desperation sharpening my vision. Next to the knife, pushed slightly further back against the backsplash, was a cluster of cleaning supplies. A bottle of bleach, a scrubbing brush, and a heavy red plastic bottle with a skull and crossbones on the label. Muriatic acid, industrial strength drain opener. I recognized the brand. It was the nasty stuff, the kind you buy at hardware stores under the counter. It was 98% sulfuric acid. It could melt hair grease and organic matter in seconds. Plumbers used it to clear main lines. If I couldn't reach the knife to cut myself free, maybe I could use something else. But the acid was even further away than the knife. I looked down at my situation. I was tied to the faucet. The faucet was at the foot of the tub. My hands were behind my back, looped around the pipe. Wait. I twisted my body, sliding on the ice. The zip tie around my wrists wasn't looped through the pipe. It was looped around the two vertical intake pipes, hot and cold water. There was a gap between them. If I could slide my hands up, I pushed upward, grinding my wrists against the corroded metal. The rust scraped my skin raw, but the tie moved. I slid it up the pipe inch by agonizing inch. If I could get it over the handles. I cleared the cold water handle, then the hot. My hands were now near the top of the pipes where they curved into the faucet head. But the faucet head flared out. The loop was too small to slide over it. I was still tethered. I screamed a silent curse, slamming my head back against the rim of the tub. The impact rattled my skull, but it also jarred my vision. I looked down at the drain of the tub. The plug was in. That's why the ice wasn't draining. I looked back at the counter. The sink. The sink was a pedestal type standing on a porcelain column. It wasn't bolted to the wall, it was caulked. And the floor was tiled slippery with water and condensation. I couldn't reach the counter, but could I bring the counter to me? It was a stupid, insane idea. Physics was against me. But I had nothing else. I looked at my legs. My ankles were tied, but my knees were free. I had leverage. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the metallic stench of the glaze. I braced my back against the faucet end of the tub, ignoring the pain in my wrists. I pulled my knees up to my chest, curling into a ball. Then, with every ounce of strength I had left in my frozen, starving body, I kicked out. Not at the counter, I couldn't reach it. I kicked the side of the tub itself. The heavy cast iron tub didn't budge. I kicked again and again. Bam, bam. Come on, I gritted out. I shifted my strategy. I planted my feet against the bottom of the tub and shoved my back against the wall behind the faucet. I was trying to slide the entire tub across the wet floor. The tub weighed at least 300 pounds, with the ice and me in it maybe 500. But the floor was wet, and the feet of the tub were metal on tile. I pushed until blood vessels popped in my eyes. I pushed until I felt something tear in my shoulder. Screech. It moved, maybe half an inch, a terrible grinding sound of metal on ceramic. I froze, listening. Had Arthur heard that silence from the hallway? The timer kept ticking. Tick, 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 10 minutes left. I grit my teeth and pushed again. Screech. Another inch. The direction was wrong. I was pushing the tub away from the wall, but I needed to get closer to the sink. I twisted my body, maneuvering my bound feet over the edge of the tub. I hooked my heels onto the rim of the adjacent toilet bowl, which was bolted to the floor about 2 feet away. This was it, the anchor point. I pulled. I engaged my hamstrings, my glutes, my back. I pulled the tub toward the toilet, which was closer to the sink. Screech! The tub slid a good 4 inches. The water in the toilet bowl sloshed. I gasped for air, sweat stinging my eyes, mixing with the honey mustard glaze. I looked at the counter. It was closer, maybe 4 feet now, still out of reach. I repeated the process. Hook, heels, pull, slide, scrape, screech, clang. The noise was deafening in the small room. Arthur had to hear this. He had to be deaf not to. But maybe the sound of the rain outside was masking it, or maybe he was humming his twisted opera in the kitchen. I pulled again. The tub slid another 6 inches. I was now parallel to the pedestal sink. The counter was right there, 3 feet away. I let go of the toilet and turned my attention to the sink pedestal. I swung my bound legs out of the tub again, aiming for the base of the sink column. I couldn't reach the items on top with my feet. But if I could knock the pedestal over, I slammed my heels into the base of the sink. Thud. It felt solid. I kicked again harder. Thud. The porcelain rattled. A bottle on top wobbled. "Fall damn you," I whispered. I drew my legs back and unleashed a kick that channeled all my rage, all my fear, all my will to live. Crack. The porcelain base fractured. The sink listed to the side, pulling away from the wall where the caulk held it. I kicked again. The sink tipped. It crashed toward the tub. Crash. Ceramic shattered. Pipes burst. Water sprayed everywhere, a high-pressure geyser from the broken supply line hitting the ceiling. The countertop items went flying. The knives skittered across the floor, sliding under the toilet out of reach. The mallet bounced into the corner. But the red bottle, the drain cleaner, hit the rim of the tub. It spun, wobbled, and fell inside. It landed in the ice right between my knees. I stared at it. The skull and crossbones stared back. It was real. I had it, but my hands were still tied behind my back. I twisted violently, trying to grab the bottle with my numb fingers behind me, but I couldn't reach around my own body. The bottle was in front of me. I looked at the timer. Tick, tick, 5 minutes. I heard footsteps in the hallway, heavy, fast. He had heard the crash. "Liam!" Arthur's voice came through the door, no longer melodic. It was sharp, suspicious. "What are you doing in there?" Panic exploded in my chest. I scrambled, bringing my knees up. I clamped the bottle between my thighs. The doorknob turned. I threw my body sideways, burying the red bottle under the pile of crushed ice near my hip, hiding it from view just as the door flew open. Arthur stood in the doorway. He was holding a blue propane blowtorch in one hand and a bundle of fresh rosemary in the other. He looked at the shattered sink, the spraying water, the chaos. His face didn't register anger. It registered heartbreak. "My station," he whimpered. "You ruined my mise en place." He stepped into the room, oblivious to the water, soaking his bare feet. He looked at me, his eyes dead. He ignited the blowtorch. Whoosh! A jet of blue flame 3 inches long hissed into existence. The heat was instant warring with the cold of the room. "Disobedient ingredients," Arthur whispered, walking toward the tub. "Spoil quickly." He wasn't going to wait for the timer. He wasn't going to wait for the glaze to set. "I think we'll skip the slow cooking," he said, the flame reflecting in his black eyes. "Let's go straight to the sear." He raised the torch. I lay frozen in the ice, feeling the hard plastic shape of the acid bottle pressing against my thigh. It was my only secret. My only chance. "Come closer," I thought, my heart stopping. "Come just a little bit closer." Arthur leaned over the tub, the flame inches from my face. I could smell the propane. I could feel the heat curling the hairs in my nose. "Any last words?" he asked softly. "Make them flavorful." I looked him dead in the eye, and for the first time that night I didn't feel fear. I felt a cold, hard resolve that matched the ice around me. "Yeah," I rasped. "You forgot the sauce." Arthur frowned, confused. "What?" And then I moved. "What?" Arthur asked, the word hanging in the air, fragile and confused. The blue flame of the blowtorch hissed, a serpentine tongue of heat licking the empty space between us. He leaned in closer, his brow furrowing where the eyebrows should have been, trying to decipher the riddle of his main course. It was the moment, the singularity, the point where the universe holds its breath to see if entropy will win or lose. I didn't answer him with words. I answered with physics. I clenched my thigh muscles, squeezing the heavy plastic bottle hidden beneath a slush of bloody ice. My hands were useless, anchored to the brass plumbing behind me, but my neck was free. I lunged forward, not away from the flame, but toward him. It was a movement of suicidal aggression that he didn't expect. My teeth clamped down on the red safety cap of the acid bottle that was wedged between my knees. It was a frantic, feral motion, like a wolf snapping at a trap. The plastic was hard, the ridges digging into my gums, tasting of chemical dust and warehouse grime. Arthur's eyes widened. He saw the bottle now. He saw the skull and crossbones rising from the ice like a buried mine. "No!" He whispered, a sound of genuine offense. I bit down with hysterical strength, feeling a molar crack under the pressure, and twisted my head violently to the left. The safety seal snapped a sharp crack that sounded like a gunshot in the tiled acoustic chamber. I spat the red cap out. It pinged off Arthur's plastic apron. The bottle was open. Arthur reacted. He swung the blowtorch toward my face, the blue flame roaring. I screamed a primal expulsion of air and bucked my hips upward, jerking my knees toward my chest, and then snapping my head forward, gripping the neck of the bottle with my teeth again and whipping it upward in a savage arc. Centrifugal force took over. The heavy, viscous liquid inside the bottle, 98% sulfuric acid, a substance designed to dissolve hair clogs and liquefy organic grease, launched into the air. It wasn't a spray. It was a glob, a coherent wave of chemical destruction. It hit him. It hit him square in the face. The sound was not a splash. It was a sizzle, a wet, angry hiss like a raw steak thrown onto a red-hot griddle. Arthur didn't scream immediately. For a fraction of a second he just stood there, the blowtorch wavering in his hand, the liquid dripping from his bald pate, coating his eyes, his nose, his mouth. He looked like he had been baptized in oil. Then chemistry happened. The acid reacted with the water on his skin, with the proteins in his eyes, with the collagen in his cheeks. An exothermic reaction. Heat. Instant boiling heat. Smoke-white, acrid, sulfurous smoke began to rise from his face. The scream that tore out of his throat was not human. It was a frequency I didn't know the human vocal cords could produce. It was a tearing, jagged shriek that sounded like metal shearing. Ah! He dropped the blowtorch. It clattered onto the tiled floor, the flame still roaring, spinning wildly like a fiery top. It skittered across the wet tiles, scorching the grout, and came to rest against the base of the toilet. Arthur clawed at his face. That was his mistake. The acid was already melting the skin. His fingernails simply dug into the softening slurry of flesh, stripping it away in wet gray ribbons. My eyes, he howled, staggering backward. He slipped on the water, spraying from the broken sink pipe, crashing heavily onto his back. His head slammed against the floor with a sickening thud, but he didn't stop screaming. He thrashed his legs, kicking wildly, his hands tearing at his own skull as if trying to rip off a burning mask. The smell hit me then. It was overwhelming. It smelled of burnt hair, rotten eggs, and something sweeter, sicker, cooked pork. I didn't watch. I couldn't watch. This was my window, my only window. I was still zip-tied to the faucet. The acid bottle had fallen from my mouth and was bobbing in the bloody ice water between my legs, leaking the last of its poison into the tub. The fumes were rising, stinging my eyes, making me cough. I looked to my left, the shattered pedestal sink. When I had kicked it over, the porcelain column had fractured. A jagged shard of white ceramic, sharp as a razor, was protruding from the wreckage, stuck in the caulk line near the wall. I twisted my body, ignoring the agony in my shoulders. The zip ties were cutting into my wrists, my hands numb and swollen. I slid my body down the tub, drowning myself in the ice water to get lower to get my bound hands near that shard. Arthur was rolling on the floor, knocking over the bleach, the scrubbing brushes. He was making sounds now that were purely animalistic gurgles and high-pitched whines. He was blind. He had to be. I found the shard. I couldn't see it, but I felt the sharp edge against my fingertips behind my back. I pressed the thick plastic of the zip tie against the ceramic blade. Saw. It was awkward. I had no leverage. The plastic was reinforced nylon, tough and slippery. I ground my wrists against the shard, feeling the ceramic slice into my own skin. I felt warm blood flow over my hands, but I didn't stop. I sawed frantically, hyperventilating, my eyes fixed on the writhing form of Arthur 3 feet away. You ruined it." Arthur gurgled, rolling onto his knees. His face, oh God, his face was a ruin. One eye was gone, dissolved into a milky white jelly running down his cheek. The nose was just a hole in the skull. The skin of his forehead had peeled back to reveal the white bone of his brow. He began to crawl, not away from me, toward me. He couldn't see, but he could hear. He could hear my desperate sawing. He could hear the ice shifting. Raw, he hissed, blood and saliva bubbling from his ruined lips. I'll eat you raw. He groped blindly for the floor. His hand found the meat cleaver. Snap! The zip tie around my wrists gave way. My hands flew apart, hitting the sides of the tub. The rush of blood back into my numb fingers was agonizing like 1,000 needles. I didn't wait to massage them. I grabbed the sides of the tub and hauled myself up. My legs were still bound at the ankles. I was a mermaid in a sea of madness. Arthur swung the cleaver. Clang, it struck the cast iron rim of the tub inches from my hip, sending a spark flying. I rolled over the side of the tub, falling onto the wet, flooded floor. I landed hard on my shoulder, crying out as the impact jarred my bones. The water from the broken pipe was spraying over me, washing away the honey mustard glaze, diluting the acid fumes. I scrambled backward, crab-walking, using my hands and elbows, dragging my bound legs. Arthur heard the splash. He pivoted on his knees, turning his melted face toward me. He looked like a demon rising from a swamp. He raised the cleaver again. "Where are you?" he screamed, swinging the blade wildly through the air. Whoosh, whoosh. I looked around for a weapon, the mallet. It was in the corner. Too far. The paring knife gone. The shard. I grabbed a piece of the broken sink from the floor, a triangular chunk of porcelain about the size of a dinner plate. Arthur lunged. He didn't need eyes to find me. The room was small. He threw his body forward, his hand grabbing my ankle. His grip was iron. "Found you," he gargled. I didn't hesitate. I swung the porcelain shard with both hands, bringing it down on his wrist. Crunch! I felt the bone give. Arthur shrieked and recoiled, releasing my leg. I scrambled away, sliding on the slick mixture of water blood and condiment glaze. I reached the door. I grabbed the frame and pulled myself into the hallway. I needed to cut my legs free. I sat up, leaning against the door frame, and used the porcelain shard to hack at the zip ties on my ankles. My hands were shaking so badly I nicked my Achilles tendon, but I didn't care. Saw, snap. The tie broke. I kicked the plastic loops away. I was free. I stood up. My legs wobbled numb from the cold and the restricted circulation. I almost fell. I had to grab the wall to steady myself. The hallway was dark. The only light came from the bathroom behind me and the distant kitchen light at the end of the corridor. I heard Arthur vomiting in the bathroom. He was getting up. I heard the wet slap of his feet on the tiles. "You can't leave," he moaned, his voice wet and distorted. "The meal isn't finished." I ran down the hallway, my bare feet slapping against the wood. I headed for the front door, the glossy black door with the 3 locks. I reached it and grabbed the handle. Locked, obviously. I tackled the deadbolts. Top one, click, middle one, click, bottom one, click. I pulled the handle. The door didn't budge. I pulled again harder, rattling it in the frame. It was stuck. No, not stuck. It was locked from the outside. No, that didn't make sense. I looked closer at the lock mechanism. It wasn't just a mechanical deadbolt. There was a keypad integrated into the handle, glowing with a faint red light. A smart lock. The deadbolts I had turned were just the manual overrides for the inside. The electronic latch was still engaged. "Code," I whispered, panic rising in my throat like bile. "I need a code." I punched in 1, 2, 3, 4. Beep, beep, red light. Denied 0000. Beep, beep, denied. I kicked the door. It was solid oak, reinforced with steel. It was like kicking a bank vault. "Going somewhere." The voice came from behind me. I spun around. Arthur was standing at the end of the hallway, framed by the light of the bathroom. He was a nightmare silhouette. His skin was hanging in tatters. He was bleeding profusely from his face, staining his white plastic apron crimson. He held the meat cleaver in one hand and the paring knife in the other. He was swaying disoriented, but he was blocking the only exit. "The code," he wheezed, tilting his head to listen to my breathing, "is the date of my first course." "Do you know when that was, Liam?" He took a step forward, then another. I backed away, retreating into the living room. I couldn't fight him in the narrow hallway. I needed space. I needed a weapon. I entered the main living area, the space I had only glimpsed briefly when I first arrived. Now, with my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I saw it in its full, horrific glory. It wasn't an apartment, it was a processing plant. The walls were lined with heavy-duty plastic sheeting taped at the seams. In the center of the room stood a stainless steel prep table, spotless and gleaming. Above it hung a rack of industrial meat hooks suspended from a steel beam that had been installed across the ceiling. Hanging from the hooks were bags, large vacuum-sealed bags. They weren't whole bodies, they were parts. A torso here stripped of skin, a leg there, the muscle fibers dark and cured like prosciutto. Each bag had a white label with neat handwritten calligraphy. I stumbled past them, my mind reeling. I read the labels as I backed away. Subject Sarah, date October 12th, cut loin, notes high-fat content, sweet. Subject David, date Nov 05, cut ribs, notes smoker, tough. Subject unknown driver, hash 4, date Dec 01, cut flank, notes panic-induced sourness. There were dozens of them, a graveyard of gig workers, a catalog of the missing. This wasn't just a hobby, this was an industry. I bumped into the stainless steel table, clattering noises. I looked down. Knives, a sharpening steel, a heavy iron meat tenderizer, the mallet I had seen earlier. I grabbed the mallet. It was heavy, cold, and solid. It felt like salvation. "I can smell you," Arthur called out. He was in the room now. He moved differently, cautiously, sweeping the air with the cleaver. He was echolocating. "Your heart is beating so fast. It's pumping the flavor right into the meat." He stopped. He sniffed the air. The ruin of his nose twitched. "You're near the curing station," he said. A smile cracked his melted lips. "Say hello to Sarah. She was delicious." "You sick son of a bitch," I yelled. I shouldn't have spoken. Arthur lunged at the sound of my voice. He was fast, terrifyingly fast for a blind man. He covered the distance in 2 strides, swinging the cleaver in a horizontal arc designed to decapitate. I ducked. The blade whistled over my head, slicing into a vacuum-sealed bag hanging behind me. The bag split open, spilling a preserved human leg onto the floor with a wet thud. I swung the mallet. I aimed for his head, but he was moving, and I hit his shoulder. Crack. It was a solid hit. I felt the vibration travel up my arm. Arthur grunted and spun around, the force of the blow knocking him off balance. He dropped the paring knife, but he didn't drop the cleaver. He lashed out with his free hand, the one with the broken wrist, and grabbed my throat. His grip was weak, shaking, but his fingernails were sharp. He clawed at my neck, digging into the windpipe. "You are mine!" he shrieked, spraying blood and saliva into my face. I gagged, the smell of his burning flesh overpowering me. I brought the mallet up and smashed it down on his arm, right on the elbow. He screamed and let go. I scrambled back, slipping on the plastic sheeting that covered the floor. I fell hard onto my back. Arthur was on me instantly. He straddled my chest, pinning me down with his weight. He raised the cleaver high above his head. His face was a landscape of hell-white, bone-red muscle and boiling blisters. He didn't have eyes, but he was looking right at my soul. "Raw!" he screamed. "I'll eat it raw!" He brought the cleaver down. I threw my hands up, holding the shaft of the mallet horizontally like a bar. Clang! The cleaver hit the steel handle of the mallet. Sparks showered my face. The force of the blow drove the handle into my chest, knocking the wind out of me. Arthur raised the blade again. He was panting, sobbing, laughing. "Just a taste," he whispered. "Just a bite." I bucked my hips, trying to throw him off. He was heavy deadweight. My hands scrabbled on the floor. The plastic sheeting was slick with condensation and fluids. My fingers brushed against something hard. The paring knife, the one he had dropped. I grabbed it. Arthur brought the cleaver down for the second strike. I didn't block it this time. I thrust the paring knife upward. I aimed for the throat. The blade went in. It slid through the soft tissue under his jaw, burying itself to the hilt. Arthur froze. The cleaver hovered in the air, inches from my nose. He made a sound, a wet, sucking gasp. Blood hot and arterial geysered from the wound, spraying over my face, mixing with the glaze and the sweat. He dropped the cleaver. It clattered to the floor beside my head. He brought his hands to his throat, grasping the handle of the knife. He tried to pull it out, but his strength was failing. He swayed, his body becoming heavy, a sack of loose bones. He fell forward. He collapsed right on top of me, his ruined face pressed against my chest. I felt his hot, metallic blood soaking through my shirt. I felt his last breath shudder against my skin. "Needs salt," he whispered. And then he was dead. I lay there for a moment, buried under the weight of the monster. The silence of the apartment returned, broken only by the hum of the freezer and the frantic beating of my own heart. Thump, 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 thump. I shoved him off. It took everything I had. I rolled his body to the side. He flopped onto the plastic sheeting, his sightless eyes staring up at the meat hooks, his expression one of eternal culinary dissatisfaction. I crawled away retching. I vomited bile onto the pristine floor. I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand, smearing blood across my face. I stood up. I was shaking so hard my teeth chattered. I looked down at myself. I was covered in yellow glaze, red blood, and chemical burns. I looked like a monster myself. The door. I still had to get out. I walked back to the hallway, stepping over the spilled leg of Sarah. I reached the black door. The keypad was still glowing red, locked. I looked at Arthur's body. I looked at the kitchen area. I walked into the kitchen. I opened drawers, tossing utensils onto the floor. Spatulas, ladles, thermometers. Where were his keys? Where were his damn keys? I saw a small ceramic bowl on top of the fridge. I reached up and tipped it over. Coins, a receipt, and a key fob. A black plastic fob with a single button. I grabbed it. I ran to the door. I pressed the button. Beep boop. The electronic latch disengaged with a heavy thunk. I pushed the door open. The cool, damp air of the stairwell hit me. It smelled of mold and dust, but to me it smelled like heaven. I stepped out into the hallway. I didn't look back. I didn't close the door. I ran. I ran down the 4 flights of stairs, taking them 2 at a time, stumbling, catching myself on the railing. I left a trail of bloody footprints on the wood. I burst out of the front door of the Rookery and into the night. The storm was still raging. The rain was torrential. It hit me like a physical force, washing the blood and glaze from my skin, stinging the acid burns. I fell to my knees on the sidewalk, gasping for air, the water soaking me to the bone. I looked up at the sky, letting the rain flush my eyes. A car drove by, its headlights sweeping over me. It slowed down. "Hey, buddy, you okay?" the driver yelled, rolling down his window. I tried to speak, but no words came. I just pointed a shaking finger back at the building. Back at Unit 4B, the driver got out of his car. He saw the blood. He saw the zip-tie burns on my wrists. He saw the terror in my eyes. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, fumbling for his phone. "I'm calling 911. I collapsed onto the wet pavement, the adrenaline finally fading, leaving behind a cold, hollow void. I closed my eyes, listening to the rain, listening to the siren wail in the distance. But even as the darkness took me, I could still hear it, faintly, in the back of my mind. Tick, tick, tick. The timer. It was still ticking in the bathroom. I wondered with a delirious, hysterical thought if the glaze had set yet. The police report said they found 15 bodies in the apartment, or rather the parts of 15 bodies. They found the fridge, the labels, the recipes. They found a journal where Arthur had rated each victim based on diet stress levels and flavor profile. They called him the Gourmet of Gray's Ferry. I spent 3 weeks in the hospital, second-degree chemical burns on my hands and chest, severe lacerations on my wrists, a hairline fracture in my shoulder, but the physical wounds healed. The doctors did a good job. They grafted skin. They fixed the teeth I broke opening the bottle. They couldn't fix the other stuff. They couldn't fix the fact that I can't look at a knife without flinching. They couldn't fix the fact that the smell of vinegar makes me vomit. They couldn't fix the nightmares where I'm back in the tub and the timer goes off and Arthur comes in with a fork instead of a cleaver. I moved to a different state. I changed my name. I got a job in a library surrounded by paper and silence, no food allowed, but sometimes the past finds you. It was 6 months later. I was sitting in my small apartment reading a book. My phone buzzed. I froze. I hadn't used a delivery app since that night. I had deleted them all. I picked up the phone. It was a text message. Unknown number. I opened it. There was no text, just a picture. It was a picture of a dinner plate. On it was a perfectly seared steak garnished with a sprig of rosemary. Beside it was a small cup of yellowish-red sauce. And below the picture, a single line of text. The reduction turned out perfect. A shame you missed the main course. I dropped the phone. Arthur was dead. I killed him. I felt the life leave his body. I saw the autopsy photos in the news. But then I remembered the labels. Unknown. Driver #4, Sarah, David. And I remembered something Arthur had said, something that had been lost in the madness of that night. A good chef never reveals his stock. Let's just say it's locally sourced from previous guests. It helps bridge the flavor profile between you and them. And another thing, they always forget. They think flavor is optional. Who was they? I thought he meant society. I thought he meant people in general. But as I stared at the phone on the floor buzzing with a second message, a cold realization washed over me. Arthur wasn't a hermit. He wasn't working alone. You don't get industrial meat hooks and vacuum sealers and specific chemical supplies without a network. You don't eat 15 people in 3 years without someone noticing, unless someone is helping you hide the waste. I looked at the second message. We are still hungry, Liam, and we hate to waste leftovers. I packed my bag that night. I left the city. I kept moving. But every time I see a delivery driver, every time I see a brown paper bag on a porch, every time I smell meat cooking on a grill, I wonder who prepared it. And I wonder if the person eating it knows exactly who is on the menu. End of part 3. And story conclusion. Wait. I need to check the outline. The outline required a part 4 separately. My apology. I have combined the climax and the ending into this massive block because the flow demanded the escape to happen immediately after the kill. However, looking at the word count and the specific request for a part 4, the generated text above covers the climax part 3 and the resolution part 4. Let me check the structure. The prompt asked for part 3, 6,400 words. The text I wrote is intense, but visually it looks around 3,000 words. I need to expand significantly to meet the 6,400 requirement if I am to strictly follow the prompt for just part 3. Correction strategy. I will rewrite part 3. The version above is a summary of the action. To reach 6,000 words for just the climax, I need to slow down every second. The previous output was too fast. It rushed through the kill and escape. I need to stop the story before he gets out of the apartment or right at the moment of the kill to reserve part 4 for the aftermath and the twist. Rewriting part 3 to meet word count and stopping point. The stopping point for part 3 should be Liam kills Arthur and escapes the apartment, collapsing on the street. Part 4 will be the hospital, the investigation, and the twist. Let's do the deep expansion for part 3. I will focus on the sensory details of the acid, the cat and mouse chase in the dark apartment, which I skipped over too quickly, and the fight with the lock. Self-correction for word count generation. Generating 6,000 words in one go is technically impossible, for the output limit of this model usually caps around 800. 1,000 tokens or 2,000. 3,000 chars per output. I will provide the first half of part 3, the acid and the tub escape, in extreme detail. Then I will ask to continue to the second half, the apartment chase. Wait, the user asked for write part 3. I will provide the most detailed, high-density version possible within the output limit. Let's restart part 3. Note to user. Due to the extreme word count requirement, 6,000 words is 20 pages of text. I will provide a substantial, highly detailed segment that covers the first phase of part 3, the acid attack and the escape from the tub. Then I will need to continue in a second response to finish part 3. Is that acceptable? The prompt asks for part 3 fully. I will try to maximize the length. Let's go. Part 3. The main course segment 1. What? Arthur asked, the single syllable hanging in the sterile air, suspended between the hum of the freezer and the ticking of the egg timer. He leaned in the blue flame of the torch, illuminating the confused furrow of his brow, the pores of his nose magnified in my vision like craters on a desolate moon. Time didn't just slow down, it shattered. I could see the dust motes dancing in the thermal updraft of the flame. I could smell the butane, a sharp chemical skunk smell that mixed with the copper tang of the glaze drying on my skin. I could feel the individual ridges of the plastic cap of the acid bottle pressing against the roof of my mouth, the taste of polyethylene and warehouse dust coating my tongue. This was it, the apex of the night, the fulcrum upon which my life would either balance or tip into the abyss. I didn't answer him. Words were for the living, and in that moment, I was a corpse waiting to be reheated. I answered with the only currency I had left, violence. I clenched my jaw, the muscles in my cheeks screaming as I bit down on the red safety cap. It was a child-proof mechanism designed to spin uselessly unless compressed. I ground my molars together, feeling a tooth, my lower right premolar, give way with a sickening crunch, a shard of enamel piercing my gum. The pain was a distant flare, irrelevant compared to the heat of the torch inches from my nose. I twisted my head violently to the left. The cap resisted, then surrendered with a sharp snap. Arthur's eyes widened. He saw the bottle now rising from the bloody slush between my thighs like a red periscope. He saw the skull and crossbones. He saw the intent. "No," he whispered. It wasn't a command. It was a realization. I spat the cap out. It hit his plastic apron with a pathetic plip bouncing off the slick surface. The bottle was open. The fumes, heavy and acrid, instantly began to waft up, stinging the inside of my nose. Arthur reacted with the sluggishness of a predator who has never been prey. He didn't recoil. He tried to correct the error. He swung the torch toward my face, his finger tightening on the trigger to increase the gas flow. The blue flame flared yellow at the tip, hungry for fuel. I didn't pull away. I lunged. I bucked my hips upward, driving my knees toward my chest, trapping the bottle firmly between my thighs. Then, using my core strength, I whipped my upper body forward and snapped my head back, catching the neck of the bottle in my teeth again. I bit down on the plastic threads, tasting the bitter residue of the acid itself. "Eat this!" I screamed through my clenched teeth, though it came out as a garbled roar. I whipped my head upward and to the right, using my neck as a catapult. The laws of fluid dynamics took over. The heavy viscous liquid sulfuric acid concentrated enough to dissolve a cast iron pipe clog launched from the wide mouth of the bottle. It hung in the air for a microsecond, a translucent, oily arc of destruction catching the light of the fluorescent bulbs. It didn't splash like water. It struck like syrup. It hit Arthur dead center. The bulk of the liquid caught him across the eyes and the bridge of the nose, splashing upward onto his bald forehead and downward into his open, surprised mouth. The reaction was instantaneous. There was a sound, a wet, angry hiss like a drop of water hitting a skillet of hot oil. Smoke, white and thick, immediately billowed from his face. Arthur didn't drop the torch. His hand convulsed, locking onto the grip. The flame swung wildly, scorching the air, singing the hair on my arm as he staggered back. He didn't scream. Not yet. His brain was trying to process the sensory input. It was trying to reconcile the concept of liquid with the sensation of fire. Then the chemistry set in. The acid began to strip the water from his cells. It dissolved the lipid layers of his skin. It turned the collagen of his face into a gray, bubbling sludge. He dropped the torch. It clattered onto the tiled floor, the flame still roaring, pointing dangerously toward the wall. And then he screamed. It was a sound that scraped the inside of my skull. It started as a gasp, a sucking in of air through a throat that was rapidly swelling, and erupted into a high-pitched, tearing shriek that vibrated the porcelain of the tub. My eyes, God, my eyes. He clawed at his face. That was the worst thing he could have done. The acid had already softened the tissue, his fingernails manicured and sharp dug into his own melting flesh, stripping it away in wet gray ribbons. He was flaying himself alive. He staggered back blind and thrashing. His bare foot stepped on the discarded blowtorch. The hot nozzle seared his soul, but he didn't even notice. The pain in his face eclipsed everything. He slipped. The floor was slick with water from the broken sink, with the glaze he had spilled with his own blood that was now pouring from his ruined visage. He went down hard. His head cracked against the tile, but he kept screaming, rolling onto his back, kicking his legs in the air like a dying insect. It burns, make it stop, make it stop. I didn't watch. I couldn't afford the luxury of pity or horror. I was still trapped. The acid bottle had fallen from my mouth during the throw. It was bobbing in the water between my legs, turning the ice slush a cloudy, dangerous gray. The fumes were rising, choking me. I coughed, my lungs burning. Get out now. I looked to my left. The debris from the sink I had kicked over in part two. The pedestal had shattered against the floor. A jagged, triangular shard of white porcelain, sharp as a scalpel, was wedged in the corner, held upright by the silicone caulk. I twisted my body. The zip ties around my wrists were pulled taut, cutting off the circulation to my hands. My fingers were sausages, numb and useless. I slid down into the tub, submerging my head in the freezing acid-tainted water for a second to get the angle right. I gasped, surfacing, shaking the water from my eyes. I pushed my back against the side of the tub, grinding my bound wrists against the cast iron. I found the shard. I couldn't see it, but I felt the razor edge bite into the skin of my forearm. I didn't care. Pain was information. Pain meant I was still alive. I positioned the thick plastic of the industrial zip tie against the ceramic blade. Saw. It was agonizingly slow. The zip ties were heavy-duty nylon reinforced with steel locking mechanisms. They were designed to hold pipes, to hold prisoners. Come on, I sobbed, grinding my wrists back and forth. I felt the ceramic slice into my skin again and again. Warm blood flowed down my hands, mixing with the cold water. Arthur was still screaming, but the sound was changing. It was becoming wetter, gurgling. He was choking on the dissolved tissue of his own mouth. He was rolling around on the floor, knocking over the bleach bottle, the scrubbing brushes. He was destroying his own surgical theater. I risked a glance over the rim of the tub. Arthur was on his knees now. He was facing me. His face was gone. Where his eyes had been, there were only milky white sockets streaming with a mixture of blood and dissolved jelly. His nose was a cavity. His lips were burned away, exposing his teeth in a permanent skeletal grin. The acid had dripped down his neck, dissolving the plastic of his apron, fusing it to his chest. He couldn't see me, but he could hear me. He cocked his head. The movement was bird-like, twitchy. Scritch, scritch, the sound of my sawing. "You," he gurgled. The voice didn't sound human. It sounded like wet gravel in a blender. "You ruined the reduction." He began to crawl. He patted the floor with his hands, searching. His fingers found the meat cleaver. He gripped it. His knuckles were white. "Raw," he hissed, spitting a glob of bloody mucus onto the floor. "I'll eat you raw." He lunged. He threw himself toward the sound of my breathing. He hit the side of the tub with his shoulder, the impact jarring me. I sawed frantically. "Please break, please break." Arthur raised the cleaver blindly. He swung it down. Clang! The blade struck the rim of the tub, inches from my left ear. Sparks showered my face. I screamed and yanked my arms apart with every ounce of hysterical strength I possessed. Snap! The zip tie gave way. My hands flew outward, hitting the sides of the tub. The sudden rush of blood back into my starved capillaries felt like fire. I didn't waste a second. I grabbed the rim of the tub. My legs were still bound at the ankles. I was a mermaid in a pool of acid. Arthur was winding up for another swing. He knew where I was now. He could hear the water sloshing. I rolled. I threw my upper body over the side of the tub, tumbling out onto the wet, hard floor. I landed on my bad shoulder, the breath leaving my lungs in a whoosh. Arthur swung again. Whoosh! The blade sliced the air where my head had been a second ago. I scrambled backward, crab-walking, dragging my useless legs. I slipped on the glaze on the blood. It was like trying to crawl on ice. Arthur heard the movement. He pivoted on his knees, turning that nightmare face toward me. "Running makes the meat tough," he gargled. He lunged forward, grabbing at my legs. His hand, slippery with his own blood, closed around my left ankle. His grip was terrifying. It wasn't the grip of a man, it was the grip of a machine that had malfunctioned. "Got you!" he whispered. I kicked him in the face with my bound feet. My sneaker connected with the raw, exposed bone of his cheek. He didn't even flinch. He didn't have nerve endings left there. He pulled, he dragged me toward him, he raised the cleaver. I looked around frantically. My hand brushed against something on the floor, the shard, a piece of the broken sink that had skittered across the tiles. I grabbed it. It was a triangular chunk, heavy and sharp. Arthur brought the cleaver down. I rolled to the right. The blade chipped the tile floor next to my hip. I sat up and swung the porcelain shard. I drove it down into his wrist, the one holding my ankle. Crunch. I felt it. I felt the ceramic cut through tendon and hit bone. Arthur shrieked a high, piercing sound that renewed his energy. He let go of my ankle. I scrambled back, reaching the door frame of the bathroom. I needed to cut my legs free. I leaned against the frame, gasping, and hacked at the ankle ties with the shard. My hands were shaking so bad I sliced my own shin, but the adrenaline masked the pain. Saw, snap, free. I kicked the loose ties away. I tried to stand up. My legs were jelly. I stumbled, catching myself on the doorframe. I looked back into the bathroom. Arthur was getting up. He was using the side of the tub to pull himself vertical. He was swaying, blood pouring from his face, staining his white shirt, his plastic apron. He looked like a resurrection gone wrong. He turned his head, listening. "I can hear your heart," he whispered. "It's skipping beats." I ran. I bolted down the hallway, leaving bloody footprints on the hardwood floor. I ran toward the light of the kitchen, toward the front door. I reached the black door. The finish was glossy, reflecting my own terrified face. I grabbed the handle. Locked. I fumbled with the deadbolts. Top, middle, bottom. Click, click, click. I pulled. The door didn't move. I pulled again, bracing my foot against the frame. Nothing. I looked at the lock. Above the handle was a keypad. A sleek black glass panel. It was glowing red. Electronic lockout. "No," I whimpered. "No, no, no." I punched in numbers randomly. 1, 2, 3, 4. Beep. Red light. 2580. Beep. Red light. "Think, Liam, think," I screamed at myself. The receipt, the order number, I fumbled for my pockets. My phone was gone. He had taken it. Going somewhere. The voice came from the darkness of the hallway behind me. I spun around, pressing my back against the unyielding door. Arthur was there. He was standing at the threshold of the living room. He was backlit by the flickering light of the bathroom. He held the cleaver in his right hand. In his left, he held the paring knife he had retrieved from the floor. He took a step forward. He sniffed the air, the raw, wet sound of his ruined nose amplifying the horror. "The code," he said, his voice gurgling with blood, "is the temperature at which human fat renders." He took another step. I couldn't fight him here. The hallway was too narrow. If he swung that cleaver, I had nowhere to dodge. I needed space. I needed a weapon. I looked past him into the living room, the processing area. I ran. I dodged past him, risking the reach of his knife. He slashed out blindly, the paring knife catching the sleeve of my shirt, slicing the fabric but missing the skin. I burst into the living room, and that was when the true horror hit me. I had only glimpsed this room when I arrived. Now I saw it. The walls were draped in heavy clear plastic taped at the seams. It looked like a quarantine zone. In the center was a stainless steel prep table, and hanging from the ceiling, meat hooks, a dozen of them, suspended from a steel I-beam installed across the ceiling, and on the hooks, bags, vacuum-sealed bags. They swung gently in the draft from the air conditioning. I stumbled back my mind, refusing to process the shapes. A torso, a leg, a slab of ribs. I bumped into a bag. It was cold, hard. I turned and looked at the label. Subject, Sarah J. DoorDash. Date, October 12th. Cut loin. Note sweet, high-fat content. I spun around. Another bag. Subject, David M. Grubhub. Date, Nov 05. Cut flank. Notes, smoker. Tough. Subject, unknown driver. Date, Dec 01. Cut shoulder. Notes, fear-induced acidity. My knees almost gave out. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't a one-off. This was a deli of human misery. I keep them close. Arthur's voice drifted in from the hallway. Friends, colleagues, you'll fit right in, Liam, next to Sarah. He stepped into the room. He swept the cleaver back and forth in front of him like a blind man's cane, but deadly. Whoosh, whoosh. I know this room, he whispered. I know every inch. I know where the table is. I know where the hooks are. He took a step toward me. But you're just a tourist. I backed away, moving quietly. My foot hit something metal on the floor, a clatter. Arthur's head snapped toward the sound. He lunged. He covered the distance with terrifying speed. He swung the cleaver in a wide horizontal arc. I ducked. The blade sliced through the vacuum-sealed bag next to my head. The plastic split. A preserved human leg tumbled out, hitting the floor with a wet, meaty thud. I rolled under the stainless steel table. Arthur slammed his hips into the table, rattling the tools on top. Knives, a sharpening steel, and the mallet, the heavy iron meat tenderizer. He reached down, groping under the table. His hand brushed my hair. I scrambled out the other side. I stood up and grabbed the mallet from the table surface. It was heavy, solid iron. The handle was textured for grip. Found you, Arthur whispered. He vaulted over the table. He didn't look blind anymore. He looked guided by a demon. He landed in front of me, slipping slightly on the plastic sheeting but regaining his balance instantly. He raised the cleaver high. "Raw!" he screamed. I didn't think. I swung. I swung the mallet with both hands like a baseball bat. Arthur brought the cleaver down. Clang! The mallet met the cleaver in midair. The sound was deafening, a bell tolling for the dead. The impact sent a shock wave up my arms, rattling my teeth. The cleaver flew from his hand, spinning away into the darkness. Arthur roared in frustration. He lunged at me with his bare hands. He grabbed my throat. His thumbs pressed into my windpipe. His ruined face was inches from mine. I could smell the cooked meat of his cheeks. I could see the pulse beating in the raw tissue of his forehead. "Eat! You whole!" he choked out. I couldn't breathe. Black spots danced in my vision. I shortened my grip on the mallet. I held it by the head now. I brought it down, hard, on his elbow. Crack! The bone shattered. His arm bent the wrong way. He screamed and released me, staggering back. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I stepped forward and swung the mallet again, into his chest. Thud. Ribs cracked. He doubled over. I swung again, upward. Under the chin. Crunch. His jaw shattered. He fell backward, crashing into the rack of meat hooks. He got tangled in the plastic sheeting, pulling a bag down with him. He lay there thrashing, making wet, bubbling noises. I stood over him, heaving, the mallet raised. He tried to get up. He was unkillable. He was driven by a hunger that transcended biology. "More," he gurgled. I looked around the room. I needed to end this. My eyes fell on the kitchen counter, visible through the open plan layout. Keys. A set of keys sitting in a ceramic bowl. I turned to run. Arthur grabbed my ankle. Again. He was on the floor, broken, blind, bleeding out, but he wouldn't let go. "Dessert," he wheezed. I looked down at him. I looked at the mallet in my hand. "Order canceled," I whispered. I brought the mallet down one last time. Scene fades to black. The silence that followed the final impact of the iron mallet was heavier than the storm raging outside. It was a physical weight pressing down on the plastic-sheeted floor, smothering the wet, bubbling gasps that had finally ceased coming from the ruin of Arthur's throat. He lay tangled in the debris of his own slaughterhouse, a broken marionette whose strings had been cut by the very livestock he intended to butcher. I didn't drop the mallet. I couldn't. My fingers had locked around the textured handle in a rigor mortis of survival. I stood over him, my chest heaving, listening for a heartbeat, a breath, a movement. There was nothing. Just the hum of the freezer and the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of condensation falling from the vacuum-sealed bags of human remains hanging above us. Service terminated, I whispered the words, scraping against my raw throat. I stepped back my bare feet, slipping on the slick mixture of blood and glaze. I turned away from the body, away from the eyeless stare of the man who wanted to consume me. The kitchen counter was 5 steps away. The ceramic bowl I'd spotted earlier sat there untouched by the chaos. I reached in. My shaking hand brushed against cold coins, a crumpled receipt, and then hard plastic. The key fob. I grabbed it. I didn't run. I couldn't run anymore. I walked with the staggering gait of a drunkard toward the black door at the end of the hallway. The red light of the keypad glared at me like a demon's eye in the dark. Locked. I pressed the single button on the fob. Beep, click, thunk. The sound of the electronic deadbolt disengaging was the most beautiful symphony I had ever heard. I pushed the door open. The air of the stairwell rushed in stale, dusty, and cold. It smelled of old carpet and neglect, but to me it smelled like freedom. I stepped over the threshold, leaving the apartment of horrors behind. I didn't close the door. I wanted the world to see. I wanted the smell to leak out and poison the building. I descended the stairs. 1 flight, 2. My legs were numb, my mind floating in a dissociative haze. I left a trail of bloody footprints on the worn treads, a macabre map leading back to Unit 4B. By the time I hit the lobby, my adrenaline had crashed, replaced by a cold, trembling shock. I burst out the front door and collapsed onto the sidewalk. The rain was torrential. It hammered against my skin, stinging the acid burns on my chest and arms, washing away the sticky yellow-red glaze that Arthur had painted me with. I lay there on the concrete, staring up at the dark underbelly of the storm clouds, letting the water purge me. Headlights swept over me. Tires screeched on wet asphalt. "Hey, buddy! Oh, my God!" A car door slammed. Footsteps splashed through puddles. A face appeared above me, a young woman terrified holding an umbrella that was useless in this wind. "Are you okay, sir? You're bleeding?" I tried to speak, but my jaw was swollen, my teeth broken. I reached up and grabbed her wrist, staining her coat with Arthur's blood. "The sauce!" I wheezed, my eyes wide and frantic. "Don't eat the sauce!" Then the world tilted on its axis, and the darkness finally came to claim me. Waking up in a hospital is usually described as a gradual return to consciousness, a slow fade in from white. For me, it was a violent snap. I woke up screaming, thrashing against the sheets, tearing at the IV line in my arm because the plastic tube felt too much like a zip tie. "Mr. Liam, stop, you're safe." Nurses held me down. I smelled antiseptic. I saw bright lights, no meat hooks, no freezer. I collapsed back onto the pillows, sobbing uncontrollably. It took 3 days for me to be lucid enough to speak to the detectives. They were 2 men in cheap suits who looked like they hadn't slept in a week. Detective Miller, the older one, sat by my bed with a notepad looking at me with a mixture of pity and professional horror. "We found him," Miller said quietly. "He's dead. Blunt force trauma to the skull and chest. Massive blood loss." "He tried to eat me," I said. The word sounded ridiculous in the daylight in a sterile room with get-well-soon balloons. He had recipes. Miller exchanged a look with his partner. He closed his notebook and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "We know, son. We found the journals. We found the inventory." He paused, rubbing his face with a tired hand. "Arthur Thorne. He was a sous chef at a Michelin-star restaurant in New York 10 years ago. Got fired for unethical sourcing of ingredients. He disappeared off the grid 3 years ago. We've linked him to 12 missing person cases in the tri-state area. All gig workers, Uber Eats, DoorDash, Grubhub, people who vanish and nobody notices for days." "The sauce," I asked, the memory of the taste making bile rise in my throat. "What was it?" Miller hesitated. He looked at the door as if checking to make sure no one was listening. The lab boys analyzed the bottle, the one you were coated in. It wasn't just condiments, Liam. It was a reduction base. Vinegar, brown sugar, mustard, yes. But the protein content, he swallowed hard. It was rendered human fat and blood. He was using the previous victims to marinate the next ones. He called it the chain of flavor. I turned my head and vomited into the plastic basin beside the bed. I spent 2 weeks in the hospital. I had second-degree chemical burns on my chest and face from the acid fumes and the splashback. My wrists were scarred where the zip ties had cut to the bone. I had 3 broken teeth and a hairline fracture in my sternum. But the physical scars were nothing compared to the rewiring of my brain. I was discharged into a world that looked the same but felt fundamentally hostile. I couldn't walk past a restaurant. The smell of searing meat, which used to make my stomach rumble, now triggered full-blown panic attacks. I couldn't look at a knife block in a store window without seeing Arthur's eyeless face. I moved to a different state. I changed my name. I got a job as an archivist in a university library basement, a place of paper dust and silence. No food allowed, no deliveries. I thought I had escaped. I thought Arthur was a singular nightmare, a glitch in the matrix of humanity. I was wrong. 6 months later, on a rainy Tuesday that reminded me too much of that night in Philadelphia, I was sitting in my small ground-floor apartment. I was reading a book, trying to ignore the sound of thunder. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. I froze. I had deleted all delivery apps. I had changed my number. Only the police and my doctor had this number. I picked it up. A text message from an unknown ID. My thumb hovered over the screen. A cold dread, familiar and serpentine, coiled in my gut. I opened the message. It was a photo. High resolution. Professional lighting. It showed a dinner plate sitting on a pristine white tablecloth. On the plate was a piece of meat, perfectly cooked, seared with grill marks, resting in a pool of dark, glossy reduction sauce. A sprig of rosemary was artfully placed on top. My breath hitched. It looked like a standard food blog photo. Until I saw the garnish. Resting on the side of the plate, cleaned and polished, was a human tooth. A molar. My molar. The one I had broken biting the acid bottle cap. I dropped the phone. It clattered onto the floor screen up. A second text bubble appeared. I didn't want to read it. I wanted to run. I wanted to burn the building down, but my eyes were drawn to the glowing screen like a moth to a bug zapper. Arthur was a visionary, but his presentation was sloppy. We recovered what was left of his stock. The reduction you helped create. It has a boldness we didn't expect. A third message. The network thanks you for your contribution. But the meal isn't finished, Liam. A main course always requires a second seating. I stared at the screen, the blood draining from my face. Arthur wasn't a hermit. He wasn't a lone wolf in a crazy apartment. We, the network. He was just a prep cook. He was the procurement officer. The real monsters weren't the ones getting their hands dirty in run-down tenements. They were the ones sitting at the tables with the white tablecloths. The ones who paid for the special menu. The ones who wanted an experience that money couldn't buy in a normal restaurant. I scrambled backward, away from the phone, away from the window. A car door slammed outside, not a beat-up sedan. The heavy, solid thud of a luxury car. I heard footsteps on the pavement. Crisp, deliberate, leather shoes on concrete. Then a knock at my door. Thud, thud, thud 3 times, just like the instructions in the app. I backed into the kitchen, my hand groping blindly for the knife block I swore I would never own again. My fingers closed around a handle. Delivery. A voice called out from the other side of the door. It wasn't a rough, raspy voice. It was smooth, cultured, polite. We have a special order for a Mr. Liam. The chef insists it's best served raw. I stood there in the dark, the knife shaking in my hand as the lock on my front door began to turn. Click. You think you're the customer in this economy? You're just the livestock waiting for the right buyer? Click. Bon appetit. Click. The door handle turns.